The funny thing about greed is that it usually smiles right before it loses everything. That was the thought running through my mind as I pushed open the heavy glass door of the law office on a grey Tuesday morning in Hartford, Connecticut. The building was quiet except for the faint hum of the air conditioning and the soft tapping of dress shoes against polished marble floors. I adjusted the sleeve of my black jacket and took a slow breath before stepping into the conference room where my late father-in-law's will was about to be read. The room was already full. My sister-in-law, Victoria Carter, sat near the head of the long oak table, surrounded by relatives who seemed drawn to her confidence like moths to a porch light. She wore an expensive cream-colored suit, a diamond bracelet that caught every beam of sunlight, and the kind of smile that suggested she believed the future already belonged to her. No one noticed when I entered. No one waved. No one offered me a seat. I wasn't surprised. For years, I had become invisible whenever Victoria was around. She had a talent for taking up all the space in a room without ever raising her voice. I quietly chose a chair near the back wall and folded my hands in my lap. Conversations continued without me. My husband had passed away several years earlier, and after that, many family gatherings seemed to happen around me instead of with me. Across the room, Victoria laughed softly at something her son whispered. Several relatives immediately laughed with her. Watching them, you would have thought she was the center of the family universe. Robert Carter's universe, however, had looked very different during the last 5 years of his life. While others attended holiday dinners and posed for family photos, I was the one driving him to medical appointments before sunrise, picking up prescriptions during snowstorms, and sitting beside him during long afternoons when he simply wanted someone to talk to. I never expected anything in return. He was family. That was enough for me. Yet as I sat there, I could feel the judgment in the room. To many of them, I was simply the widow who had somehow remained on the edge of the Carter family tree. Victoria glanced toward me and briefly raised one eyebrow. The gesture lasted less than a second, but the message was clear. She looked completely certain of how this day would end. A few seats away, someone asked whether the attorney was running late. Another relative joked about how long legal paperwork always took. The room filled with polite laughter. Then the door opened, and Attorney Daniel Brooks walked in carrying a thick folder and a locked document case. The conversation stopped instantly. Every eye followed him as he placed the case on the table. Victoria straightened in her chair and crossed one leg over the other. Her smile widened. Around her, family members leaned forward with anticipation. I noticed something else. Daniel Brooks did not look relaxed. In fact, he looked like a man carrying information that might change more than a few lives before the afternoon was over. Daniel Brooks remained standing for a moment, his hand resting on the locked document case as if he were carefully choosing his next words. The silence in the room became almost uncomfortable. Then he cleared his throat and offered a professional smile. Thank you all for coming. Before we begin, I would like to remind everyone that Mr. Robert Carter left very specific instructions regarding today's proceedings. Immediately, I noticed Victoria exchange a confident glance with her son. She looked completely relaxed. If anything, she seemed eager for the reading to begin. Daniel opened the folder first and reviewed several pages. The sound of paper turning echoed through the conference room. Around the table, relatives shifted in their seats, waiting for numbers, properties, and bank accounts to be mentioned. I could almost feel their expectations hanging in the air. As many of you know, Daniel began, Mr. Carter updated portions of his estate plan several times over the past few years. Victoria nodded as if she already knew exactly what was coming. However, Daniel continued, he also left instructions that a personal statement must be read before any distribution details are discussed. That announcement produced several puzzled expressions. Victoria's smile faded slightly for the first time. A personal statement, one cousin asked. Daniel nodded. Yes. Mr. Carter insisted that everyone present hear it. He removed a sealed envelope from the folder and carefully unfolded several pages. I felt my stomach tighten. I had no idea what Robert had written. During the final months of his life, he often told me there were things he wished the family understood, but he never explained what he meant. Daniel adjusted his glasses and began reading. The statement was not about money. It was not about investments or property. Instead, Robert spoke about family. He wrote about loyalty, kindness, and the difference between showing up for special occasions and showing up during ordinary days when nobody was watching. As the words filled the room, several relatives became noticeably uncomfortable. Robert described how true character revealed itself during difficult seasons of life. He mentioned long hospital visits, early morning appointments, and quiet conversations over coffee. He never used anyone's name, but I knew exactly which memories he was talking about. I remembered snowy mornings when I drove him through icy streets before sunrise. I remembered carrying grocery bags into his house when his arthritis made simple tasks difficult. Across the table, Victoria folded her arms. Her expression remained controlled, but the confidence she carried into the room seemed slightly weaker now. Daniel continued reading. Robert wrote that appearances could be deceiving. He said some people were experts at looking devoted when an audience was present. Others served quietly without expecting recognition. The room grew still again. Nobody interrupted. Nobody laughed. Nobody checked their phone. For the first time that morning, everyone seemed to understand that this reading was not going to follow the script they had imagined. Then Daniel reached the final page of the statement. He paused, looked around the room, and said, "Mr. Carter included one additional instruction immediately following this letter." Victoria straightened in her chair. Every eye returned to the attorney. Slowly, he placed the letter aside and reached for the locked document case. Daniel inserted a small key into the lock and opened the document case with deliberate care. The metallic click seemed louder than it should have been. Inside was a collection of folders, several sealed envelopes, and a flash drive secured inside a transparent evidence sleeve. A murmur spread across the room. Victoria leaned forward. "What exactly is all of that?" she asked. Daniel looked up calmly. These materials were left by Mr. Carter with instructions that they be reviewed in a specific order. Victoria forced a smile. "Well, I am sure Robert had his reasons, but perhaps we can move on to the actual estate distribution." Several relatives nodded in agreement. They had clearly come expecting numbers and property valuations, not a lesson about family loyalty. Daniel did not react. He removed a blue folder from the case and opened it. The next instruction concerns a personal record maintained by Mr. Carter during the final 3 years of his life. That caught everyone's attention. Victoria crossed her arms again. "A personal record of what?" she asked. "Of visits, communications, and assistance he received," Daniel replied. The room fell silent. My heartbeat quickened. I had never heard anything about a record. Daniel began reading dates. Week after week. Month after month. The entries listed who visited Robert, who called him, who attended appointments, and who helped with daily responsibilities. At first, nobody understood where this was going. Then patterns began to emerge. Many names appeared only once or twice. Some appeared during holidays. Some appeared around birthdays. Others appeared shortly before family gatherings. Then Daniel reached a section covering the previous 18 months. My name appeared repeatedly. Sometimes 3 times in a single week. Sometimes attached to notes about transportation, grocery shopping, paperwork, or medical consultations. I felt every eye in the room slowly turning toward me. Victoria shifted in her chair. "This seems unnecessary," she said. Daniel continued as though he had not heard her. Another page. Another month. More entries. Robert had documented everything. Not because he was keeping score, but because he wanted an accurate account of his final years. Then came something nobody expected. Daniel opened a smaller envelope and removed several handwritten notes. Mr. Carter requested that these observations be read aloud. Victoria visibly stiffened. The first note described gratitude toward people who offered help without being asked. The second described disappointment in those who treated family obligations as public performances. The third contained a sentence that seemed to freeze the entire room. The people who love you when there is nothing to gain are the people who truly belong in your life. Nobody spoke. Even Victoria remained silent. For the first time since I arrived, her confidence appeared uncertain. Then Daniel placed the notes on the table and reached for the flash drive. There is one more item Mr. Carter specifically instructed me to present before the will itself is discussed. Several relatives exchanged nervous glances. Victoria swallowed hard and looked directly at the flash drive. Whatever she had expected from this day, it was becoming increasingly clear that Robert Carter had planned something far more complicated than anyone in that room had imagined. Daniel connected the flash drive to a monitor mounted on the conference room wall. Every person at the table watched silently as the screen came to life. After a few seconds, Robert Carter appeared on the display. He looked older than most people remembered him, but his eyes were sharp and focused. The recording had clearly been made only a few months before his passing. "If you are watching this," Robert began, "then the family is gathered together, and Daniel is following my instructions exactly as I asked." A faint smile crossed his face. Several relatives leaned closer. Victoria sat perfectly still. "I know some of you are probably wondering why I insisted on this recording," Robert continued. "The answer is simple. I wanted my own voice to be heard one last time." The room remained completely silent. Robert spoke calmly about the importance of honesty. He said that people often reveal who they truly are when they believe nobody is paying attention. He explained that over the years he had learned to observe actions instead of promises. "Words are easy," he said. "Real character shows up on ordinary Tuesdays, not only on holidays and special occasions." I felt my chest tighten as memories flooded back. The long drives. The quiet conversations. The afternoon spent helping him sort paperwork or simply sharing coffee at his kitchen table. Robert continued speaking. "There were people who checked on me because they cared about me. There were also people who checked on me because they cared about what I owned." A ripple of discomfort moved through the room. Nobody spoke. Nobody even shifted in their seat. Then Robert surprised everyone. "Before any discussion of assets begins, I want something made clear. This is not a reward ceremony. This is not a competition. The purpose of my estate is to reflect my values." Victoria forced a small laugh. "Well, that is certainly dramatic," she muttered. A few relatives glanced toward her, but nobody joined in. On the screen, Robert continued. "Some people may be disappointed by decisions they hear today. Some people may be surprised. But every decision was made carefully and intentionally." Daniel stood quietly beside the monitor, allowing the recording to play uninterrupted. Then Robert mentioned something that immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. "Several months ago, I asked Daniel to preserve additional documents that support my final decisions. Those documents are included because I never wanted misunderstandings after I was gone." Victoria's confident expression finally cracked. Her eyes moved quickly toward the attorney. "Additional documents?" she asked. Daniel did not answer. He simply kept watching the screen. Robert nodded slightly in the video, as if anticipating the reaction. "If anyone believes my choices were impulsive, they should know they were not. I reviewed everything more than once." The recording paused for a brief moment before continuing. "Now that you have heard this, Daniel may proceed with the next stage." The screen went black. For several seconds, nobody said a word. The room felt completely different from when the meeting had started. The certainty that had surrounded Victoria was beginning to fade. Yet despite everything that had already been revealed, Daniel looked down at the folders inside the document case and said, "We are still not at the will itself. There is one more item Mr. Carter instructed me to present first." Daniel reached into the document case once more and removed a thick sealed packet marked with Robert Carter's signature. The attorney placed it carefully on the table before looking around the room. Mr. Carter instructed that this packet be opened only after the family viewed the recording, he said. Victoria let out a slow breath and shook her head. How many surprises did he leave behind? She asked with a strained smile. Nobody answered. Daniel broke the seal and pulled out several documents. The first page immediately caught his attention. He read silently for a few seconds before speaking. This document was signed and notarized approximately 3 weeks before Mr. Carter passed away. Several relatives exchanged curious looks. Victoria sat up straighter. 3 weeks before, she repeated. Yes, Daniel replied. And according to his instructions, this document must be acknowledged before the estate distribution begins. The tension in the room continued to build. I remained quiet, trying to understand where all of this was leading. Daniel began reading portions of the document aloud. It was not a will. It was a formal statement explaining Robert's reasons for reviewing his estate plan one final time. He wrote that important information had come to his attention during the previous year. He explained that certain assumptions he once held about family relationships had changed. The room became noticeably uncomfortable. Victoria shifted in her chair again. This feels unnecessary, she said. Robert already updated his will several times. Why are we reviewing all of this? Daniel looked at her politely. Because those were his instructions. Victoria pressed her lips together but said nothing more. Daniel continued. Robert described how illness had given him clarity. During difficult periods, he learned which relationships were built on genuine care and which ones existed only when circumstances were convenient. He wrote that gratitude mattered deeply to him. Loyalty mattered even more. Then Daniel turned another page. His expression changed slightly. There is an attached list of meetings and communications that influence Mr. Carter's final decisions, he said. The room became completely silent. Victoria stared directly at the papers. For the first time all afternoon, she looked nervous. Daniel reviewed the documents before continuing. Mr. Carter documented several situations in which information presented to him by family members was later determined to be inaccurate. A cousin frowned. Someone across the table shifted uncomfortably. Victoria immediately spoke. What exactly does that mean? Daniel remained calm. The document does not identify individuals at this stage. Her shoulders relaxed slightly. But only slightly. Then Daniel opened another envelope attached to the packet. Inside was a short handwritten note. He read it aloud. If anyone is surprised by my final decisions, they should understand that I based them on actions I personally witnessed and facts I personally verified. The words seemed to hang in the air. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The confidence that had filled the room when the meeting began was gone. In its place was uncertainty. Then Daniel carefully placed the final page on top of the stack and said something that caused every person at the table to look up at once. We have now reached the point where Mr. Carter instructed me to begin discussing the estate itself. However, before I read the current will, I must first explain why an earlier version exists and why he specifically ordered that both versions be discussed today. The room remained frozen after Daniel mentioned the existence of two versions of the estate plan. Victoria was the first to break the silence. Why would there be two versions? She asked. Her voice sounded steady, but there was a tension beneath it that had not been there earlier. Daniel folded his hands and answered carefully. Because Mr. Carter made significant revisions shortly before his passing. Victoria immediately nodded as if she had expected that. Explanation. That is normal, she said. People update documents all the time. Yes, Daniel replied, but in this case, he wanted the family to understand exactly why the changes were made. He opened another folder and removed a document labeled Previous Estate Distribution Plan. This version was valid for nearly 4 years, he explained. Under this plan, the majority of Mr. Carter's financial assets, investment accounts, and several real estate holdings would have been distributed among a small group of beneficiaries. Several relatives leaned forward. For the first time all afternoon, people were hearing information directly related to the estate itself. Daniel began outlining portions of the earlier plan. As he spoke, it became obvious that Victoria had every reason to feel confident when she entered the room that morning. The previous version had been extremely favorable to her side of the family. A cousin quietly raised his eyebrows. Another relative exchanged a surprised glance with someone across the table. Victoria sat taller in her chair. Some of her confidence appeared to return. "That sounds more like the Robert I knew," she said. A few family members nodded. Daniel continued reading details from the earlier document. Then he stopped. "However," he said, "Mr. Carter specifically instructed that this version never be viewed as his final intention." The confidence that had begun returning to Victoria's face disappeared almost instantly. Daniel lifted another page from the folder. According to his written statement, he became concerned that certain assumptions influencing this plan were inaccurate. Nobody spoke. Over time, Daniel continued, he conducted his own review of personal records, communications, and family involvement. Victoria crossed her arms. "What exactly does that mean?" she asked. "It means he re-evaluated information he had previously accepted as true," Daniel answered. The room became uncomfortable again. Daniel then read a paragraph written directly by Robert. In it, Robert explained that he had initially believed some family members were far more involved in his daily life than they actually were. He admitted that appearances had influenced several earlier decisions. He also wrote that objective records eventually revealed a different reality. The words landed heavily. Nobody needed names to understand the implication. Victoria looked toward the window and avoided eye contact with everyone else. Then Daniel revealed another detail. "Mr. Carter instructed me to state for the record that the previous version of the estate plan was preserved for one reason only. He wanted everyone present to understand how dramatically his conclusions changed after reviewing the facts." A long silence followed. The relatives who had seemed so certain at the beginning of the meeting now looked confused. "Even I did not know what the final outcome would be." Then Daniel slowly closed the folder containing the earlier plan and placed his hand on a second document resting beside it. "Everything we have discussed so far," he said, "was preparation. What happens next concerns the final version Mr. Carter signed 3 weeks before his passing, the version that legally controls the distribution of his entire estate." Daniel carefully opened the final estate document and adjusted his glasses before looking around the room. Nobody spoke. The anticipation that had filled the conference room all afternoon had reached its peak. Even the relatives who had arrived expecting a routine reading now seemed uncertain about what would happen next. Daniel began with several standard legal provisions, moving methodically through personal belongings, charitable donations, and smaller financial accounts. The details were important, but they were not what everyone was waiting for. Victoria sat motionless, her eyes fixed on the pages in front of him. Every few moments she glanced toward the attorney, as if trying to predict what was coming. Then Daniel reached the section concerning Robert's primary assets. The room immediately became still. "According to the final estate plan," he said, "all major distributions are to follow the instructions outlined in Article 7. Several relatives leaned forward. Victoria clasped her hands together. Daniel continued reading. One investment account was assigned to a charitable foundation Robert had supported for years. A vacation property was designated for sale, with proceeds directed into a family trust. Several smaller assets were distributed among relatives. Victoria appeared relieved. Nothing seemed unusual so far. Then Daniel turned the page. His expression became more serious. The remainder of Mr. Carter's estate, including the primary residence, the majority of financial holdings, and management authority over the Carter Family Trust, shall be transferred to a single beneficiary. A wave of tension swept through the room. Victoria actually smiled. It was small at first, but unmistakable. She sat taller in her chair and glanced briefly in my direction. The look carried the same confidence she had worn when I first entered the building that morning. Around the table, several relatives seemed to assume they already knew the name Daniel was about to read. Daniel paused for a moment. Then he spoke clearly. The sole beneficiary designated by Mr. Carter is Emma Carter. For a second, nobody reacted. The word seemed too unexpected to process. I felt my heart stop. Across the room, several relatives stared at me in disbelief. One cousin actually looked back at Daniel as if he had misread the document. Then Daniel repeated it. Emma Carter is the beneficiary designated to receive the remaining estate assets and trust authority described in Article 7. The silence that followed felt endless. Victoria's smile disappeared instantly. The color drained from her face. She blinked several times and leaned forward. "That is not possible," she said quietly. Daniel calmly turned the document toward her. "This is the final signed and notarized version." Victoria stared at the page. Her confident expression collapsed into shock. The relatives who had spent the afternoon gravitating toward her suddenly looked uncertain about where to focus their attention. Nobody knew what to say. I sat frozen, unable to fully understand what I had just heard. Yet Daniel was not finished. He closed the estate document and reached for one final sealed envelope. "Mr. Carter left additional instructions to be read immediately after this announcement," he said. And according to his written note, those instructions explain exactly why this decision was made. Daniel held the final envelope carefully before opening it. Nobody in the conference room seemed interested in the estate documents anymore. The room had become focused on a different question entirely. Why had Robert made such a dramatic change? Victoria remained frozen in her chair, staring at the papers on the table. The confidence she had carried throughout the day was gone. Daniel unfolded several handwritten pages and looked around the room before beginning to read. "To my family," he said, reading Robert's words aloud, "if you have reached this point, then you already know my final decision. What matters now is understanding why I made it." The room remained silent. Robert's letter was written in a tone that felt personal rather than legal. It sounded less like a formal document and more like a conversation. For many years, Daniel continued reading, "I assumed loyalty and love were easy to recognize. I believed that the people who spoke the loudest about family were often the people who cared the most. Age taught me that I was wrong." Several relatives lowered their eyes. Nobody interrupted. As my health declined, I found myself relying on others more than I ever expected. At first, I was embarrassed by that reality. Eventually, however, I realized it gave me a gift. It showed me who was willing to help when there was no audience. I felt my throat tighten. The memories returned again. Early mornings. Long drives. Quiet afternoons. None of it had ever felt extraordinary at the time. It was simply what family did for one another. Daniel continued. Some people visited when it was convenient. Some people called when there was something to discuss. Some people enjoyed being associated with me when others were watching. But one person consistently showed up when there was nothing to gain. The room became even quieter. Nobody needed help understanding who Robert meant. Daniel turned the page. Emma never asked for recognition. She never asked for compensation. She never treated kindness as a transaction. During some of the most difficult periods of my life, she provided support with patience and dignity. Across the table, several relatives glanced toward me. Their expressions had changed completely from earlier in the afternoon. "I am aware that my final decision may surprise some people," Daniel read. "It may even disappoint them. But inheritance should reflect values, not expectations. It should honor actions, not assumptions." Victoria stared at the table without speaking. Robert's words continued. "This decision was not made in a moment of emotion. It was made after years of observation. I reviewed records. I reviewed conversations. I reviewed my own experiences. The conclusion became unavoidable." Daniel paused briefly before reading the final section. If anyone feels hurt by this choice, I encourage them to look beyond the money. The real lesson is much larger. The people who stand beside you during ordinary days often matter more than the people who appear during important moments. A deep silence settled over the room after the last sentence. No one seemed eager to speak. The letter had done more than explain Robert's decision. It had exposed a truth many people had ignored for years. Then Daniel carefully folded the pages and said quietly, "There is one final note Mr. Carter asked me to read before we conclude today's proceedings." Daniel looked down at the final note and smiled faintly before opening it. By then, the atmosphere inside the conference room had completely transformed. The tension, confusion, and anticipation that had dominated the afternoon had gradually given way to reflection. Even the relatives who had arrived focused entirely on the estate now seemed more interested in Robert's final words. Daniel unfolded the page and began reading. If this note is being read, then the meeting is almost over. I imagine some people are relieved, some are surprised, and some may still be upset. That is understandable. Families are complicated. They always have been. A few quiet smiles appeared around the table. Robert's familiar voice seemed to come through even in the written words. I spent many years building my career, managing investments, and acquiring property. Like many people, I once believed those things represented success. As I grew older, I learned that the most valuable things in life cannot be measured on a financial statement. Daniel continued reading. The older I became, the more I realized that time is the one resource nobody can replace. The people who willingly share their time with you are giving something far more valuable than money. I lowered my eyes as the words settled over the room. If I have one regret, the letter continued, it is that I did not recognize certain truths sooner. I spent too much time assuming people would always understand how much they meant to me. Gratitude should never remain unspoken. Daniel paused briefly before reading the next section. Emma, if you are hearing this, I hope you understand that this decision was never about rewarding you. It was about acknowledging you. You gave your time freely. You offered kindness without expectation. You showed up during ordinary days when nobody else was paying attention. I noticed. Even when I did not always say it, I noticed. Tears filled my eyes. Around the room, several relatives quietly looked away. Nobody seemed interested in debating the estate anymore. Robert's words had shifted the conversation far beyond money. To the rest of my family, Daniel read, I hope you do not leave this room focused on what you received or what you did not receive. I hope you leave focused on what truly matters. Relationships require attention. Loyalty requires effort. Love requires action. The room remained silent. Victoria sat motionless. She no longer appeared angry. Instead, she looked thoughtful, as if she were replaying years of memories in her mind. Daniel reached the final paragraph. One day, each of us will be remembered. When that day comes, people will not gather to discuss our bank accounts. They will remember how we treated others. They will remember whether we showed up when it mattered. That is the legacy worth leaving behind. Daniel lowered the page. No one spoke for several moments. Then he carefully folded the note and placed it beside the other documents. The meeting was officially over, but nobody rushed toward the door. As people slowly stood and collected their belongings, something unexpected happened. Several relatives approached me one by one. Some offered kind words. Others offered apologies. Victoria remained seated until nearly everyone had left. Then she finally stood, looked at me for a long moment, and quietly said, I think Robert wanted us all to learn something today. I nodded. There was nothing left to argue about. As I walked out of the building and into the cool afternoon air, I realized that the most important thing Robert had left behind was not an estate. It was a reminder that true worth is measured by the lives we touch when nobody is keeping score.